In this lesson, we're going to take what we saw in TDD and we're going to write tests that are a little bit more what you might see in production. So we're going to focus on Django View, but also assuming that the Django View is going to have templates and whatnot. So I'm going to be starting with two tabs here, and I'm going to use the right tab in my terminal to go ahead and edit code, and the left tab over here I will use to try and run the actual tests, and that will hopefully make the loop pretty clear. So what I've gone ahead and I've already moved into lesson 1.03 within the repository, and we're simply going to step through the code that exists in the repository so that you don't have to watch me type. Hopefully that makes this as clear as possible without making it so that you are watching me sort of henpeck my way through. So we're going to go back into test app, back into tests, and all the way at the bottom, I have added something called test status get. Now you can see that I have also, all the way at the top of this file, which I believe we will just do this, you can see that I have imported from Django URLs reverse, and the first thing I'm doing is I'm saying I would like to go and find a URL named site status. I then would like to make sure that the site status reversal gives me a URL that I expect. And then I'm going to go ahead and use Django's test client to actually go and get that URL, right? And this is sort of the core of our test, where we issue a GET request, and then we expect that Django is going to come back with a response. And then the core of that test is going to be what we want to make sure that response does. So as we've previously seen, we're going to go ahead and check that the status code is 200. But then what we're also going to go ahead and do is we're going to say, we want to make sure that the response used a set of templates. I've seen debates about whether you should start by saying it uses the right template or whether you go ahead and you make assertions about the content. I tend to like to start with the template, because if you have the wrong template, of course you're going to have the wrong content. Whereas if you have the wrong content, you may begin by looking at the wrong template. So that's my opinion on the matter, but there are lots of people who disagree with me. So go however you think you might be writing your material and the errors that you are most likely to make or that your team is most likely to make, and target your test accordingly. So we then have a whole host of these templates used, right? Because we expect that we're going to be using template inheritance, where we have, this is our sort of, the main template is then going to inherit from base, which then inherits from the root base. And then once we know that we are using the right templates, we say, well, we would like to make sure that the template context has a variable named status. And then we go a step further and we say, not only do we want there to be a variable named status in the template context, we would like to make sure that that variable has the value good within it. After that, we say, well, once we have the right templates, and once we know that the template is being passed in the right variables, we can go ahead and say, we want the template to go ahead and have the following HTML inside of it, and we make sure that we're loading in the content by first decoding it, because by default it is going to be in bytes. So now, in the first tab, I'm simply going to go ahead and write docker compose run in the Django container python manage.py test and test app, and you could just run test again, but once again I'm using test app to run these tests a little bit more quickly. So we go ahead, it finds our containers, makes sure that the database is there, and runs our tests. And you can see, as expected, this is failing. And the first thing that is failing is it says there's no reverse match. So that makes a certain amount of sense. We are reversing something, but there is no such URL pattern. Okay, well, you know what? Let's come out. I'm going to say git next. And then what you can see is if I do git show, it'll show us the changes that we made. And in test app URLs, I went ahead and included a new class-based view, and you can sort of assume that following Python standards by making sure that the class is capitalized, so you can see that. And then if you suspected as much, you can see I'm calling as view on status, and that it's called site status. And then down here, I'm doing sort of the bare minimum. I'm going ahead and saying, oh, let's have a template view. I inherit template view, and then I say, well, I sort of expect that it's going to be for status.html. Great. So you can see that I'm skipping a few steps, but hopefully not egregiously breaking TDD, right? You'll notice if we go ahead and run the test, that I've specified that there is a template that we would like to have used, but I haven't actually created it so that we have a slightly different error. So back in the tab on the right, I can just do git next again. And if we do git show, you can see that I've gone ahead and I've just moved into test app. And this time, instead of putting the templates within the root template directory under src, so if I right here, and I'm not putting it in here, I'm actually putting it in a templates directory in test app, and then in the test app namespace, and then going ahead and just, creating that file. And empty template is an actual string that I've just kind of put in there for the sake of making sure that Git can commit this content into the repository. So we come back, the template now exists, and so surely our test will pass, right? Not so much. So we're seeing exactly the same test, or exactly the same error, from the same test as saying, well, hey, this doesn't exist. So the nice thing about your test is that it will identify configuration errors as well. Django at this point has the ability to load in this Python code, but it doesn't recognize our test app as an installed Django app, and that's because we never told it about it. We never configured installed apps. So I'm going to move ahead one step using git next, and you can see that now within our base settings, I've gone ahead and at the end of installed apps, I've gone ahead and in our first party set of lists, I've added the test app config for our new test app. So now I come back and I run the test again. Aha! So we see that our template base.html is not working. So status.html. Now you'll notice that had I used subtest, I would be seeing that both of the templates are missing. Not only that base.html is missing, but that the test app base.html is missing. So this is a problem with my test that we are going to optimize very shortly. This is sort of a disadvantage here that I wanted to make very, very clear. We're only seeing one of the assertions failing, even though it would be in our interest to see both of the assertions for the templates failing. But so I can come over, I can do git next, and you can see that what I've gone ahead and done is I've created a base.html for test app, which refers to the base.html here. This is actually a typo. This should really be base template, because otherwise the parent template here is going to make it so you can't change base without changing this parent, which is somewhat unfortunate and gets confusing. So that is a typo on my part. But you see we're just extending the status into base.html. So this, at this point, should allow us to run our tests again and to see a different error. Pow. Goodness gracious. This is what happens when you don't write a helpful error message. You can see that in the test code, I was simply saying, oh yes, I want to assert that there is a variable named status within the context. And Django, the unit test runner in Python tries to be very helpful, and it tries to say, well, this is all the stuff that I did find, but this is not necessarily helpful if you aren't paying very close attention to what's going on. It would have been much more helpful if I'd written a string here that says, oh, I couldn't find status in the template context. Instead, I have the entire context printed out in front of me. So another improvement that we could make to our test. But we've actually gone ahead and made a change, and so I can move forward, and you can see that now what I've done is I've used the extra context instance variable on the template view, and I've said yes, I would like there to be a status variable. And again, I've somewhat skipped a step here. In pure TDD, you would not necessarily move directly into adding good as the string, but I'm breaking the rules a little bit here, and that said, I don't break the rule where we come back, I've made a change, and I run the test. Okay, so we can see that we're now at the place where we're checking the actual content. We are going to go ahead and change the template. We're going to go ahead and change what's within the content block. You can see that I've gone ahead and simply said, oh, the status is, and the status variable that we are passing in as extra context. And so now if I run test app, so through the magic of video editing, we're back. As it turns out, one of the things I was forgetting to do is to add a --rm flag on my various test runs. And what that meant was that I was leaving a whole host of containers around, and I don't have a whole lot of space on my hard drive. And so as it turns out, that caused my entire operating system to sort of stop and go, no, 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 you have no space, you cannot continue to do this, and cause Docker to crash. So to try and mitigate that, what we're going to do is we're going to use the --rm flag to then automatically remove each of the containers that is run for each of the test runs. So that will hopefully mitigate that problem, and hopefully you've learned something from watching me crash my machine. So we had just made changes, and so our goal was to run these tests, and lo and behold, we see that all of our tests have now passed based on, again, the last change, which was simply to add some content into the template. Now, I would like to go ahead and refactor the test based on some of the stuff that we previously saw as we were going about it. So I'm just going to do git next and then git show. And you can see that the first thing I've done, as I mentioned, we want to do because it helps with our test output, is instead of running an assertion for each of the template used, or the templates that we would like to have used, I've gone ahead and created a list of all the templates and then used a single assertion within a loop which uses the subtest. So that way, if we're missing any of these, we'll see all of the missing templates, and sometimes that can help diagnose more complicated hierarchies that you might have in your templates. And then the next thing I'd like to do is introduce a completely different tool. So you can see that what I've done now is I've gone ahead and I've changed the import of test case from Django's test case. I'm now using a tool called Test Plus. You have a link to the documentation here, but in short, what it is it's a host of tools that allow you to write your tests in a slightly more terse, shorter fashion. It's provided by the folks at Revolution Systems, and it just makes some of the writing a little bit quicker. So let's see what has changed, right? So we started off initially by saying, okay, we're going to go ahead and we're going to reverse site status. We're then going to issue a request to the URL at site status, and we want to make sure that the status code is 200. This pattern is so common, it becomes somewhat painful to write. Go find the URL, go get it, and then actually, check it. That they've provided a method that simply handles that for you. Get check 200 site status. Now, you'll notice that there is a slight difference. This is lovely, it's super helpful, I use this all the time, but we are no longer checking that the URL is actually /status, right? So that is a bit of a change, and so depending on how you are set up, and how you want to be testing, I would urge you to maybe write a separate set of tests that goes through for all of your URLs, and then make sure that the various reversal for your URLs is behaving as you would anticipate, to make sure that you adhere to a sort of cool URL, as Tim Berners-Lee might say, or Sir Tim Berners-Lee would have you do. Now, the next set of changes that are enabled by this new tool is that we have the ability to shorten the various assertions we have about the content and the context. So you can see, instead of saying, I would like to assert that status is in the context, there is an actual assertion that for us that is simply assert in context. Now, this is not provided by Django, right? This is provided by the Test Plus module or package. And so we go ahead and we simply say, yes, we'd like to make sure that status is within the context. And similarly, we can, instead of writing assert equal and then fetching status from the context and saying good, we simply say, oh yes, we assert in the context that the status variable is good. And this is just a little bit shorter, a little bit easier to read. Finally, instead of using Django's assert in HTML, where we have to pass in HTML, there is an assert response contains. And this is sort of lovely because you don't have to pass in HTML. You can say, no, I just want to check that there is a string here. And so we can simply say status is good. Now we don't care if it's in p tags or li tags or whatever we've decided to sort of put in there. With that, we've seen a slightly more realistic pattern for following TDD with Django, as well as seen ways where we will always be able to improve our tests, as well as seen a few shortcuts that we might be able to take, both by using subtest, which is provided by Python's unit test, as well as using external packages that might help us write terser, clearer tests.